Mine.
Hello, 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 hello.
There we go.
Can you hear me? Yeah? Hello? Hello, hello, hello? Am I heard out there? Ah, there we go. All right, good evening, everybody. How are you feeling? Yes. Hey, I know we did this last week, but who did take this class a year ago? Who took this class a year ago? Yeah, a couple of us took it. Taking it again, high achievers. Appreciate y'all. Very good. I see a lot of new faces, which is awesome. We are so grateful that you're here. My name is Ryder. I'm one of the pastors on staff here, and I have the privilege of kind of overseeing Equip, and it's been really cool to see it grow over the years. It started as one event back in like 2018, and then we said, hey, this is kind of cool environment, and the event turned into some classes on Sunday mornings, and it turned into doing an occasional podcast to now doing these classes called the Institute, and in this building, there's several other electives that are taking place right now under Equip, and so we are grateful because you're a part of that growth. The more you sign up for these kind of things, the more we get a chance to make minor tweaks. As a matter of fact, we do at the end of this class, you're going to have a chance to give us feedback. And some of the things that you're seeing this second go around in this class, even to the tables, to the curtains, to the snacks, to the teaching styles, came as a result of your all's feedback. And so we really appreciate that. So thank you for being a volunteer learner and committing to these 18 weeks. I was told to tell you that we have some new coffee that might be a little stronger. It's still decaf. Maybe I shouldn't have told you that. But it's still decaf, but it is brewing. There's more brewing. So if you got a cup that you were dissatisfied with, go back for seconds, and hopefully you'll be more satisfied with that second batch, all right? Just a couple of things. If this is your first encounter with Equip, we do offer now a podcast that does air regularly. Jeff, who you met last week, who was holding the microphone last week, he's on there. One of our other teachers, not for this class, but another class, her name is Lori Winkompleck. The three of us do a weekly podcast about faith, the scriptures, theology, and culture. And we call it Equip. It's called the Equip Roundtable Podcast. And so anywhere you get a podcast, if you have a commute or a workout, it's about 30 to 40 minutes of a conversation. And so we would encourage you to download that. We also do have Sunday morning classes. We have one coming up called Bible Study Basics. And it's a class that will just take you 3 weeks on Sunday mornings over in Building B Cafe. And Jeff Moore and Carrie Runn, our women's director, teaches that and just helps you do what it says. Bible Study Basics. Learn how to get in the Word and read devotionally for yourself. So we'd encourage you to sign up for that. All right. I'm going to go ahead and pray tonight. You guys have an awesome teacher coming up here this evening, and I'm going to let him introduce himself. But for now, I'm going to go ahead and pray. All right. God, thank you so much for tonight. Thank you for these people who have decided to sign up to buy some books, to read during the week, to invest in their spiritual growth. And Father, I pray for them that I know what it's like at 6:10 on a Wednesday evening where the adversary is throwing everything at them to cause them not to come. I'm thankful for the perseverance and endurance for them to come here and be amongst this audience here, the fellow learners, to learn and grow more about your word and more about what it means to believe what we believe and defend what we believe. So, Father, I pray over this class tonight. I pray for John as he comes to discuss what he's going to discuss. Lord, we just pray for fruit to bear as a result. I pray this in Jesus' name. Amen.
Thanks, Joey. Everyone, I think, can hear me okay. Yes, thumbs up. Is it too loud? Okay, all right, sounds good. I do have one administrative announcement before we get started. Sarah, our class host, has discovered that someone has lost their phone. Who is missing a phone? Okay, if you do discover you're missing your phone, we've got an extra one. Yeah, or this is going to go into some excellent, refurbishment program. I don't know. Who knows? Okay, let me make sure. Okay, perfect. So it is an absolute privilege, and I'm super excited to be here. We have got a stuffed agenda. We have tons to cover. I am thrilled to do this for the second year in a row. Last year was my first year, and we learned a ton. But before we get started, one thing that is unique about these next 2 weeks, well actually, and at least the classes that I get to be a part of, is that we do live Q&As. So please pull out your phone if you have one. And the person who lost theirs, maybe this is the time they'll discover they lost their phone. I'm not sure. But hopefully, given our Sunday mornings here, you're familiar with what a QR code is. It took me forever. I think it took me like 4 weeks to find the QR code between the seats. I was like looking week after week, and I finally found it. But either way, we have a live tool where if you do the QR code, that'll take you directly into the web app. Or if you just want to go to slido.com, there's a code event, and you can put in ARE, Austin Ridge Equipped, that's what it stands for. That'll take you to the live tool. What we use this for is that as you may have questions or thoughts during our conversation tonight, please type them in to that tool. Your peers and everyone else can see what those questions are, and then you can actually upvote and rank which ones you want to hear an answer from. So it's a great way for us to like recap at the end of the session to talk about what are top of mind for you guys. And it's anonymous, so feel free to throw the zingers. That's always fun. So looking forward to our Q&A at the end. Here's our agenda for tonight. I said it was packed. I'm just going to give a very brief introduction. The theme for the next 2 weeks is about having effective spiritual conversations. We're going to spend 2 weeks on this because this is, I think, the most important thing that you can have as it relates to being able to influence people for Jesus. You can know a lot of information, you can have a lot of knowledge, you can know a lot of content, but if you can't effectively have a conversation with someone, I don't know, like, I'm not going to say the content is not important, but certainly your ability to influence other people and win people for Christ is going to be deeply affected by your ability to have effective spiritual conversations. So we're going to just give a brief introduction, then we're actually going to go through, I think, some of the pre-read material that you guys read, which are just understanding why taxes are needed, how to be influential, and then we're going to start diving into the 3-step process. And then if we have time, I actually have a bit of content right before our Q&A where I'm going to talk about how to approach really difficult questions that you may be asked. So we've got a full agenda. We'll take a break here in probably 20, well, not 20 minutes, but like probably about 30 minutes, and then we'll keep going. Does that sound like a plan? Okay, let's do it. So just to give an introduction for myself really quickly, my name is John Craig. I live 5 minutes down the road. I've been here as a partner at Austin Ridge for almost 5 years, I think. And there's really nothing remarkable about me. I work in regular corporate America. I've got a wonderful, beautiful wife and kids, and I do my 9-to-5 job. The thing that's interesting, or maybe is different about me, is I grew up in an interesting household. Gary mentioned last week, as he was talking about well-known apologetics people, one of those happens to be my dad. And so I grew up in an interesting household where around the dinner table, I was getting taught logic lessons about why God exists versus like, hey, how's your day? What did the math teacher tell you? So the reason I share that is I grew up in a very Christian household with a Christian apologetics expert. I went to church religiously every Sunday, right? Like Brad talks about, get in here on Sundays, bring your family. Oh, we went like every Sunday, like we were there. I went to Christian college, got a minor in Bible, so I know my Bible pretty well. Despite all of that upbringing, I entered my early 20s like having thoroughly rejected like Christianity. Like I wanted nothing to do with God or Jesus or anything like that. In fact, I viewed really religion and Christianity as like a method to try to control your behavior and make you feel guilty about your actions. Now, obviously I'm back, but the thing that brought me back was the fact that I could not escape that Christianity was actually true. Right? It wasn't about my feelings, right? Like, it wasn't, I wanted to submit, I wanted a God over my life, an authority figure that I wanted to submit to. It was like, it was objectively true that I could not escape that Jesus was a real person who died, who rose from the dead, and that was the best explanation for like the Christian faith and the Christian doctrine. And so like that really, really makes a difference on why like I think apologetics matter. And I know, like, from last year in the conversations that we had as we talked about this content and had these conversations, so many of you are here tonight because of family members, right? It's either I have a son, I have a daughter, you know, I've got a spouse, I've got in-laws who don't know Jesus, and how the heck do I bridge that gap? Maybe I'm at a hopeful example that apologetics can make a difference in that, but certainly I think the content and the conversations we're going to have over the next, I think, 7 weeks now, hopefully will help if that's something that you really deeply care about. So that's a little bit of my story and why this is important to me. I think in terms of learnings for last year, just for, you know, we have one repeat, I think, tonight, so thank you for making it. Last year we did the conversation weeks, we did them last. So actually we spent the first 6 weeks talking all basically factual information, like why does God exist, the historicity of the New Testament, the resurrection of Jesus. And then we spent the last 2 weeks talking about how to turn that into a conversation. This year we're doing basically the exact inverse based on feedback from, I think, the class last year. And why that is like leading up to those 6 weeks, everyone was like, yeah, this is a great conversation, but how do I tell my friend, or how do I tell my son or my daughter, or those types of things. And so we wanted to arm everyone here with this information up front as we then learn all these, you know, factual, evidence-based reasons here later in the preceding weeks. So that's the thought and that's the hope. So I hope none of this is too much jumping the gun, but we're going to teach you a whole bunch of like content and facts in the preceding weeks. So please look forward to that. And then, yeah, I think I basically said this, right? The point is that we need to be able to have a whole bunch of content, like we need to know information, and we need to bridge that gap in terms of being able to have an effective conversation with people. And that's really what Tactics is about, and that's what the book is about, and what we'll spend the next 2 weeks about. Okay? So I just want to be clear on like what we're going to be doing the next 2 weeks, and equally clear on like what we're not going to be doing. Because I think that's equally important to talk about what we're not going to be doing. So you can see that we're going to cover a pretty simple, repeatable process to have an effective spiritual conversation. I really emphasize the simplicity and repeatability. Like, if you can have a method that you can really know that you're in a spiritual conversation, know you need to follow some certain steps and guidelines, and reasonably believe that a good outcome will occur, I think that hopefully improves your confidence and improves hopefully your courage in having those conversations and inviting those in. We're going to talk about differences between effective and non-effective approaches, and then we're going to hopefully practice and enhance your skills. I really believe, and what you'll hear from me, is that having good spiritual conversations is a skill. And like any skill, the more you do it, the better you're going to get at it. But it absolutely is something that you can learn and can get continuously better at. We're not going to be teaching you the only way to have a spiritual conversation. So like this is not like this is the only way. There's lots of different effective ways. We have an evangelism class here as I think part of the broader Equip umbrella program. So this is just one way, but I think it provides a lot of usefulness. And we're not going to teach you like how to win, right? So like you get a question, what's the answer? Win. Like that's not what we're going to be doing here. This is really about how to win people to Jesus and how to do it in an effective manner. And what I often discover is sometimes you can win the argument and lose the person. I don't know if that's ever happened to you, but definitely happened to me. And we're going to require a lot of learning, right? There's going to be a lot of learning. We're going to grow, we're going to stretch, and it's going to be fun. Or at least I think this is fun. Hopefully you think it's fun, but it's going to be fun. Okay? So here's a question for the audience. Can you convince someone that Christianity is true? What do you guys think? Somebody raise a hand. Somebody give an opinion. With the help from the Holy Spirit, that's absolutely true. Fantastic. Yes, ma'am. If they're ready to hear it, all right. No no's? Nobody saying no? I don't think so. Okay. Here's the second question. Can you convince Julius Caesar was a real person? I think we're all going to say yes to this one, right? So the key is like, what's the difference? Anybody got an idea? Okay. Yeah. Great. Yes, sir. Did you read ahead? Yeah. Did you read ahead? So that's right. Like, one of those facts makes a huge difference in your life. Another fact doesn't. Like, who cares if Julius Caesar was a real person or not? If Jesus is, like, if Christianity is true, oh man, like, you gotta deal with that. Like, you've got to really examine your life in light of that, right? And so I think this is something we don't often appreciate when we engage in conversation, is like, we're talking about life change for people. And like, I don't know about you, but I can barely break my habits, in the morning, to, read an extra 15 minutes a day, let alone change my entire orientation of my life. Or these are big, big stakes. And so as you think about like the elements of a spiritual conversation, it's not about just trying to convince someone that a fact is true. It really is trying to convince something of something that will change their entire life, their being, their meaning in life, etc. So these are big, big stakes that we're having these conversations over. And not only that, but when you have these conversations, because those stakes are so high, there's obviously lots of differing opinions, and as a result, there can be really strong emotions, right? And these elements of like high stakes, differing opinions, strong emotions, these are not unique to spiritual conversations. I don't know in the last several months if anyone's had an abortion conversation, but like abortion conversation, high stakes, differing opinions, strong emotions, how well did those conversations go? For me, those typically don't go the best. Like those like get intense really quickly. Many of like your very intense conversations that you have, if you think about it, like in the business world where I work, we call these like crucial conversations, and it's typically when someone's maybe not doing so great. These elements exist, and they cause really, really, really high barriers to have an effective conversation. And one of the reasons is like actually biological, right? Like your system gets hijacked basically with like a fight or flight response, because all of the implications that these conversations bring out and the emotional reactions that these bring out. And so these kinds of elements require you to have really intentional skills and practices around them, because biologically we're all predisposed to having really like not good outcomes when we encounter these kind of elements in these conversations. And so that's really, really important as we think about the kind of conversations that we want to drive and have with people. And ultimately, what we want to have is like really good outcomes. This was a recent survey done by the Barna Group, which is a Christian survey group. You have this in your notes, I believe, so I know this is a little bit of an eyesore. But the bottom line is this. Christians are not super effective at having conversations, spiritually speaking. That's probably not any news to anyone, I don't think. But if you can look on that graph, like there's some big gaps, right? I mean, if you just look at the first one, the listens without judgment, on the left is basically what people hope to experience from the conversation, and then on the right in the yellow is like their actual experience with Christians. And I know I've certainly been guilty of doing a whole lot of judging in my conversations. So we're not super great at having these conversations. And again, because of the elements and the high stakes involved in these, very predisposed to not be great. And I think this is more important than ever. This is actually recent Pew Research data that was published, and again, I think this is in your notes, that showed basically the continued decline not only of Christianity, but the rise in essentially people who are not affiliated with any religion. And this statistic is actually a little bit misleading. That graph on your left still shows 60% of folks in the US identify as Christians, but that actually covers like Mormons and other types of groups that like we wouldn't necessarily align with those belief systems. Like the actual number for like a evangelical Christianity is like 24% or something like that. And so we have continuous amount of declining Christianity in our society. We have increasing amount of non-religiously affiliated folks. And so more and more your ability to influence and have effective conversations with people, like it's gonna require a skill. And we talked about this, I think Gary talked about this last week, when he talked about the personas, where it's a growing majority of people is like they look at Jesus and they say, so what? Right? That's basically the Julius Caesar question. Okay, Jesus existed, so what? And I think that is what you see from the graph is that's the largest growing segment of population, right? The people who are like, nothing in particular, so what? Like, that continues to grow. And that continues to, I think, be a huge opportunity. And many of our friends and family fall into those buckets as well. So hopefully you get the picture. Intense conversations, predisposed to be bad at them, more important than ever, really need to get good and practice at this skill. So that's the why behind what we're doing and the importance of those. Sound good? Okay. So each week we are going to be talking about grounding principles, or you could consider these rules of thumb. These are things that as you have conversations with people, follow these like guidelines and things will go good. If you don't follow these guidelines, typically things will not go good. So if you don't remember anything from tonight, remember these two things that we're going to talk about, okay? Which is, in your conversations, if anyone gets mad, you lose, right? Like if anyone gets mad for any reason, whether or not it's justified or not, whether or not it's their fault or not, if anyone gets mad, you lose, okay? We do not want to anger people. And there's a lot of good reasons why. One is like you want to be able to have that conversation again in the future. And if it ends in, people not feeling great and strained relationships, what's the chances of that happening again, right? So don't let anyone get mad. And then here, and this is tricky, we're going to talk about this later, when having these conversations, do not give your opinion. Ask them questions. And we're going to talk about that why in a second. But this is the one that I struggle with. Like I totally blow this one all the time, which is like I always want to inject like, oh, well, here's what I believe. And it's like, no, I actually need to ask them questions to really understand what they believe. Okay? So please keep these two things in mind, and we'll have another one next week. Okay? So let's talk a little bit more in depth on why we're doing this and why tactics are needed in the first place. So as you saw earlier, we kind of outlined the problem in terms of the difficulty of the conversations, the directions of where we're heading in terms of our culture and the religious affiliation. I've mentioned this several times now, but really we need to be influential in these spiritual conversations, and it's a skill that we have to develop. And so the question is, how do we become spiritually influential? Like how do we have a conversation with someone and they take us seriously and we have the credibility that they're willing to engage in a conversation that may change their entire worldview and their meaning in life. So there's 4 key ingredients that are outlined in terms of being spiritual and influential. There's character, knowledge, wisdom, and then I'd say communication skills. And Brad's talked about this before, but I was talking with actually someone earlier today, like what I personally run across is the reason people don't want to become Christians is because that they know other Christians. Like, I mean, like that's probably my biggest obstacle is like they know Christians or they've had experiences with other Christians. And so I think it's really, really important that you got to reflect and say, okay, am I living in such a way with my own character, and do I conduct myself in such a way with the integrity that I live with, that someone is going to respect me enough to like actually take me seriously. If someone doesn't view like you as credible from a character perspective, it's going to be really hard for them to like engage with trying to potentially change their life around that. And I know for me, like this is super convicting, especially like in the business world. Like, you got to do a lot of difficult things, have a lot of hard conversations. Am I conducting myself every day, not just to be effective in business, but like to actually be like attractive for Christ? Right? Like that's the thing that, I try to think about as I engage in my day. Is like, in the way am I behaving in a way that will actually attract people and be willing to have a conversation? You got to know stuff. Hopefully we'll take care of you over the next 6 weeks. We'll teach you a whole bunch. So we'll help you with the knowledge stuff. On the wisdom stuff, interesting, like basically you've got to be able to like this is kind of similar to character, but you got to be able to live your life in a way that like people respect. That's the bottom line. Like, are you able to take the knowledge that you have and apply it to your life? And then last is communication skills, and that's what we're going to be working on the next 2 weeks, okay? And, one pushback that I've received or seen in the past where it's like, well, really practicing on your skills in terms of being able to talk with people, that's like inauthentic in some way. Or it's like, it's manipulative because you're trying to learn a method to like talk to people, to do all those types of things. And I think that, one, I just don't agree with that. But I think here's the thing. Like, you have the Apostle Paul in the New Testament basically saying, I'll become anything in order to win people for Jesus. And I think if we truly care about people and if we truly love people, we should be willing to change how we act and how we are naturally inclined to communicate to try to win people to Jesus and be most effective in communicating that truth to them. And so I actually think that like us being willing to change our communication styles and patterns is actually a demonstration of love for other people and care for other people. It's not some like trick that we're trying to engage in for our own personal benefit. And so, I think hopefully hopefully we don't have that concern, but happy to take a question on that if there is that question. The other thing I want to share a bit about is just like, how do we define success? And I think, for me personally, quite frankly, I think was discouraged for many, many years in terms of sharing my faith with people. And the reason is like my conversion rate, which I know sounds cynical, but my conversion rate was low. It was low. Like, I was like, I talked to 10 people. Nobody said that they wanted to like follow Jesus as their Lord and Savior and those kind of things. So like, I kind of got a bit discouraged, but I think the book really highlights this well, and I think this is a great point, which is there is a real difference between a harvester and a gardener, right? There are people who are really like gardening and laying the seeds and planting ideas and having those initial conversations. And then there are people or moments where there's a harvest. And, we don't control when that is. We all have a role to play in that process for everyone. And I think especially today, I think coming to faith is likely a journey for people versus like they encounter one thing that they had never encountered before and then they change their mind completely and they've accepted Jesus. Like, I just think we live in a very skeptical age where people are bombarded with basically marketing of all kinds. And so the idea that people are going to be able to, in a single moment, change their entire worldview, I think is difficult. And so I think what this means for each one of us is that we got to think about when we have these spiritual conversations, like what's the goal? What's the end objective? What am I shooting for? And I think that all too often our bar of success is like, well, did they accept Jesus as their Lord and Savior? And if it doesn't happen, we feel like disappointed or somehow we didn't measure up, which is, I think, the definition here is a much more modest, much more realistic, and a much more encouraging definition, which is when you have a conversation, just leave someone with something to think about. Now, hopefully they accept Jesus, and we shouldn't turn away people who say they want to do that, but far too often, I think, in the conversations you have, just leave someone with a positive interaction, and did you give them something to think about? Right? So if you're having a conversation and like, all truth is your truth and my truth is your truth and whatever, like, just give them something to think about. Like, I think that is a good thing. And what I've discovered in my own life is like the more like consistent, small, positive interactions you have with people and the more you give them something to think about, they come back to you and they're like, hey, that thing you mentioned last time, hey, like I've thought about that in the meantime and here's my answer. Like, what do you think? And so I hope this is encouraging in the sense of like, when you have a conversation, I know what you're having and then shoot for a goal of trying to give that outcome, because I think most of your conversations are going to be the gardener type. I think harvesting is much more infrequent compared to like the percentage of gardeners, okay? Let me see what time, okay. So I'll do a couple more just to introduce the 3-step process, and then we'll take a break, and then we'll deep dive into the first step. So just by way of introduction, I'm going to go through the first 3 steps. We're only going to cover step 1 tonight, okay? So the 3 steps are get clear on what someone believes, ask them why they believe it, and then ask them questions that challenge their beliefs. So I mentioned simple, repeatable process earlier and kind of what we were going to do. That's it. Like, that's the process. Get clear on what they believe, ask them why, ask them questions that challenge their beliefs. And you can use this in a variety of ways. If someone's, asking you proactive questions, like, why do you believe that crazy stuff, right? You can, answer those questions and, use this process and apply that method to that. Or if you're actually trying to strike up a conversation with someone proactively, you can use this method as well. And we're going to go through examples of that in the next 2 weeks. So you can use this both when someone's asking you a bunch of questions or when you're just trying to strike up a conversation with someone. A little bit on why this works. I think ultimately, if you think about that 3-step process in terms of getting clear on what someone believes, why they believe it, and then asking the questions, ultimately it's a very simple process in the sense that if you look at someone who doesn't believe in Jesus and doesn't believe in Christianity, they have a particular worldview. They have a particular view of reality. Like, what's the point of life? How does truth play into that? Where does morality play into that? Who created the universe, right? They've got a particular view of reality. And what you're going to learn, and maybe you already know all this, is that there's a biblical view of reality, right? There's a Jesus' view of reality in terms of what is the right way that, we should be living, or did Jesus really rise from the dead? Is there a God? Those type of things. And when you compare those two worldviews, what you end up with is differences, right? Those don't align. And so essentially what you're going to be doing is you're going to be identifying where those two worldviews don't align, and that's where you're going to ask your questions about, right? So, for example, we believe that there's such thing as objective truth, right? Or objective morality. Many people in society today don't believe that's true. They just think it's a matter of perspective. And so those are two opposing worldviews. We can be able to ask questions about those, and we'll teach you how to do that. Okay, so that's why this is so effective, and that's why this works. And it's very we'll get to this going back to our grounding principles. It's very inoffensive to ask someone. It's oh well, you believe this, but what about this? What are your thoughts there? Just throwing up little objections to hey, but have you thought about this? What do you think? It's very, very disarming in terms of the approach. So with that, it's just shy of 17. Let's take a quick break. Let's be back at 7:15, and then we'll deep dive into step number 1. We'll talk about difficult questions that you may get asked, and then we'll do Q&A. Sounds good? Thank you. All right, this is your one minute warning, 1 minute countdown. All right, let's bring it back. We'll start here in just a couple seconds. While we're getting everyone back, I checked the Slido, and man, we got some zingers in there. So you guys are firing those questions away. It should be a good time later. Should be a good time. So either way, looking forward to that. Okay, we ready? All right. Where's my clicker go? Oh, I lost it. Okay, there we go. All right, so we're gonna just deep dive into the first step, which is to get clear on what someone believes, okay? And so let's first talk about why, well actually, let's talk about what this, we'll talk on the next slide, like why this is important, but let's talk about like what this actually means. So it's very simple in terms of what you should do. If someone says something, all you have to do is ask them, what do you mean? That's it. So ask a definitional question and get really, really clear on what they mean. And so here's some examples, right? Has anybody ever told you that the Bible is a legend? Or maybe it's like the Bible was written by a bunch of, white men and, therefore we shouldn't trust it and all those types of things. Well, it's like, what do you mean by legend? Like, what do you mean you shouldn't trust it? Like, what do you actually specifically mean? Right? Christians are terrible, for society. Or like, what do you mean by a Christian? Like, what's your definition of that? Like, how are you defining that? Like, if you saw in the Pew Research, that Christian umbrella group, like that's a huge umbrella of a whole wide variety of different belief systems under that. All religions end up at the same place, right? What do you mean by same place? What's that same place that we're all ending up? Like, what do you mean? Your truth is my truth. Like, what do you mean by truth? It's very simple. Step one, everyone can get this. Like literally by the end of tonight, everyone can get this. If you have a conversation with someone, they express a belief, just ask them what they mean. And even if you're not like in a spiritual conversation, this is probably one of the best ways that I like proactively engage with people and like get into spiritual conversations, is that they'll express some belief about the world or about society or whatever's happening on the news. I'd be like, oh yeah, what do you mean by that? Like, what do you mean? Tell me more. Like, why do you think that? And then inevitably leads to actually people revealing how they really think about things. And ultimately, I think religion and spirituality is ultimately like people's really deepest truths about how they really think the world works and how the world operates. So this is something that you can absolutely do proactively or reactively when someone's, basically sharing a point of view on like the Bible's a legend, okay? So step one, ask people what they mean. And you can see some variations of that below, which is like, explain more. Can you elaborate? Like, what's your thought here? Like, I'm not following. And really, I'd say in practice, again, this is really easy to do. It's not offensive. Like, who doesn't love to talk more about their own opinions and why they believe them? Like, it's really difficult to make people upset by this. Now maybe if you're like on the fifth why, like, why do you believe that? Why? It's like my kids are like, they ask me like, why, Daddy, why? I lose patience after a while on that, but that's not what we're gonna do here, right? Like, just ask people what they mean, and who doesn't love to express like their own opinions in a deeper way? Now, here's why it's important. Like, you actually want to understand the point of view, right? Like, this is not, like we talked about before, like, this is not inauthentic. Like, I don't know how many mistakes that I've made where like someone's talking to me and I'm like responding to something and they're like, no, that's not what I meant. Right? I don't know if that's ever happened to you, but I know it's happened to me a lot. Where it's like, they said something, I just assumed that they meant one thing, and then like we're off the rails and the conversation's derailed, et cetera. So like, first reason, you generally want to understand like what that person's point of view is and get really, really clear on that. What I just mentioned is like you don't want to respond to their own argument. You don't want to hear like, oh, well, I think the Bible's a legend. And you're like, no, it's not. There's all this evidence. There's all these things. And it's like, no, that's not what I'm talking about. That's like not the reason I have. The interesting part about this is that I actually think that this helps people get clear on what they believe. And more often than not, actually people quickly discover that they don't really have much of a foundation on why they actually hold the beliefs that they currently do. A lot of people, it's just like repeated media talking points, or like they watched a Jesus series on CNN at Easter time about the historical Jesus, and like that's their impression of things. And so really often when you dig in and you say, like, well, why do you believe that? Like, tell me more, like, how'd you get there? Like, can you please explain? You'll find like people have very shallow, like you're not gonna go that deep basically before you hit the bottom where they're not able to really explain much more after that. So like it's really important because we genuinely want to hear what people really believe. We want to get clear on why they, well, that's the next step, but like we want to really be understand where they're coming from, because that's how we're going to know where to progress the conversation from. Okay?
But you also got to be aware you can't go too far, because otherwise you will get them angry, right? When you get to that shallow level, and you're like, I'm at the bottom there.
Well, yeah, I do talk about this later. Like, look, I mean, I'll talk about this now too, because you bring it up. Like, if you remember the infographic earlier, the biggest gap was like people want to be listened to without judgment, and we really are terrible at that as Christians in that, at least that survey and that experience. And I know for me, where I get terrible about that is not because I'm like judging another person in terms of their lifestyle choices or anything like that. It's that I get judgy with how shallow their beliefs are, and I'm like, really? You've based your life upon like a CNN Easter series? Like, really? Like that's your point of view here? Like, and that makes people feel terrible. Like, you'll see in some examples that I have, I think next week, where, I have a conversation with my father-in-law, and I actually go through the conversation, and you guys get to see that. And, he expresses a view that's just like, really not sound at all. But like how we react to that and how we treat that and how we respond to that makes immense amount of difference to people's willingness to engage and continue the conversation. If people think that we belittle their beliefs, even though they're maybe very shallow and like not good, like that's an end point for basically any conversation, because no one's going to want to continue a conversation with you if they feel belittled or demeaned in any type of way. So we're going to practice. I said we're going to practice. We're going to practice. So turn to the people to your left and right and in the back. Here are some practice questions on, here are some statements that people are making or that someone may say to you. I'd like you to get with your neighbor and basically apply step one. So how would you get clear on what someone believes if they said these things? Like, what would you say? What would you ask? And how would you phrase the question? And then we'll come back in a few minutes and go through what you guys had. Sounds good? I see nervousness. I see anxiety. All right? Come on. There's much more interaction than this next week. All right? So turn to the people around you. Go through. What would you actually say? All right, are we feeling confident? We got this? Yeah. All right, let's bring it in. Let's bring it in. Okay. How was that? It was hard? Oh, come on, really? These aren't this isn't trick questions. You guys are going to do this. This is going to be great. So what's some examples? Let's go through the first one. Can you convince someone that Christianity is true? That was our first question from tonight. Well, what did people have for that one? Someone apply step 1 to that. What do you mean by true? Very good. Very good. That's exactly what I would say. Like, what do you mean by true? Right? Make them define that. Yes, sir. Yeah. Yeah. Exactly. He said, what do you mean by Christianity? Right? There's wide definitions of Christianity, unfortunately. Great, fantastic. See, these aren't trick questions. Everyone can leave here tonight doing this well.
Basically, you're asking them to define what you mean.
Yeah, exactly.
Your definition of
Yeah.
based on your reality.
Yeah,
Right?
yeah. We want to know. We genuinely want to know what they think, right? So why do bad things happen to good people? Yes, sir.
I would, if someone asked me that, I would say, you know what? I've thought about that a lot myself.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
Similar to this? Is that the wrong tack? I'm really trying to ask, what do they believe?
Yeah. That sounds like a deflection tactic to me. Right? Which is like, I have an answer, but I don't want to give it to you.
What do you define as bad?
Right?
What do you define as bad?
Sure, but if you're, I mean, sincerely, you're probably interested in actually what they have to say about that. So, one thing you could say is like, if they say, well, why do good things happen to, or why do bad things happen to good people? It's like, well, how do you define, or what do you mean by good people? All right? What do you have?
But you can also say bad things happen to all people.
Is that an opinion? What's tonight's grounding principle? Don't give your opinion. Don't give your opinion. Yeah, so don't give your opinion. Don't give it.
Impossible. It sounds like so obvious, but it's impossible.
It's really hard. It's really hard.
Because especially if you're passionate about, you need to understand this. You just want to tell.
Yeah. That's right. That's right. Like, look, I get it. Look, I think our passion to want to tell people about Jesus is, of course, well-intentioned and overwhelming, and it's because we love people and we care people and we want them to meet Jesus, right? And we know what a life-changing experience that is. But, like, I'd say in today's culture and in today's society, you have got to be very intentioned of how you go about doing that, because otherwise you can turn people off.
The key is, are you being effective?
Right, and the data suggests that we are turning people off. That's what the data suggests overwhelmingly. Right. So, second one, you could either ask like, why do bad things happen to good people? You could say like, well, what do you mean good people? Or like, how are you defining bad things? Right. Bad things might be a matter of perspective depending on your situation. Yes, sir.
Well, I feel like sometimes we fail to do the dance.
I'm sorry.
We fail to do the dance.
Mm-hmm.
Why do bad things happen to good people? If I just put it back on them, I may want to invite them to be respected. But if I fail to answer the question, I'm failing to do the dance. And that's the thing I always struggle with. I might offer a short answer, like, well, Brooke, what do you think? But I struggle sometimes with not necessarily putting it back on them, but inviting them to be respected, inviting them to explore with you.
Yeah.
And I don't have the answer, but I
Yeah.
just don't know how we can, how I can do the dance effectively. By not at least
Yeah.
offering the question with a short answer before I ask it.
So how would you define a good person?
He's got you in a snare.
My worldview says God's holy and we're not, end of story.
Right. Right, but now I've got a bit more specific information on what you actually think, and so now I can actually take the conversation in a particular direction, where if you just take what they're saying at face value, they may mean a spectrum of things, right? When someone says the word, oh, good people, they may mean, well, as long as they do 51% more like kind acts than bad acts during their lifetime, they're a good person. Or my favorite is like, have you ever seen this when you have like statistics of good drivers? Like, did you know that 80% of people believe that they're an above average driver? That's not possible, right? Someone's got to be below average, right? 80% of people cannot be above average, okay? So like, there's a wide spectrum of definitions of words, and we're really going to speak to people like at their core and at what they really believe. Like, we got to understand that. Yes, ma'am. Yes.
I can hold a question that what do you mean with people?
Mm-hmm.
And they can say something like, well, how about a 3-year-old child who gets raped and murdered? Why is the child dead? Or why is the child deserving that kind of a bad thing happening to her?
Right. Well, but you ask them to define what a good person is, not what a bad event is.
But the good person is a 3-year-old child. How could that child deserve that kind of a horrible tragedy?
Yeah. Well,
It's just hard to throw the question back because they can look at you like, but you know what, girl, but this would be an example where I don't know what to say.
sure. Well, we'll talk about that. But like, the key thing here, and we're only on step 1, right? There's more steps to come. The key thing here is to just get clear on what someone actually believes when they say something. And then, and what you're referring to, or like, I think what you're getting at with that question is like, one thing you do have to do is you have to keep people on topic. Like, if they say, why do bad things happen to good people? And you're like, okay, well, what do you mean by good people? And they're like, there's floods everywhere. There's a hurricane right now. It's a terrible universe. It's a terrible earth. Like, that can make it for a really difficult and challenging conversation. And so there is an element of like, hey, no, like, I asked you a question on like, I was interested in like what your perspective on like what is a good person is. Like, can you tell me more about that? So you do have to sometimes do some redirection, or otherwise someone will just throw a barrage of things at you. And we'll talk through that a bit more.
It sounds like the key is to get them to think out loud, talking to themselves, what they believe.
Yeah, we genuinely want to know what the person thinks about the world and about life and about spirituality. And it's only till we are crystal clear about that should we start to inject our own opinion or maybe challenge their beliefs or maybe ask a question. But until we are absolutely crystal clear on what someone believes, we should be very, very hesitant in making a statement. Yes, ma'am. Yeah, these are good questions. Her question, I believe, was like, when do you inject like a story or like someone's story into the? Yeah. So, I'm trying to answer this knowing that we have 2 more steps to cover, which is like, this is just basically a definitional question. Like, getting to know, someone's story, I would bucket into like getting to know someone, right? Like, I think in today's day and age, the idea that a stranger is going to convince someone to change and reorient their entire worldview into submitting to Jesus and God and those kind of things, I think that is primarily done through friends and family. And like the data suggests that, right? And so I think one thing I'm probably assuming in this is that you actually know someone. Right? This is like, hopefully you actually know someone and know their background and know their story. This can be used for strangers, and it certainly is effective with strangers, but certainly I think most of the data suggests is that people come to Christ through friends and family. And so like the element of like knowing someone's story I think is important. When you inject that, I think that's maybe outside the bounds of like this like process in terms of how to engage in the conversation. Let me move us on, but hopefully you get the idea, right? Which is like, hasn't science disproved Christianity? Like, what do you mean by science, right? It's that simple, okay? Then there's extra steps, and we're going to get to like what those next steps are next week. So I want to cover one more thing. I've got like a wrap up of this, but I'll skip to that. Oh, where'd my clicker go? Oh, here it is. So I'll skip the summary for now. I'll come back to it. But before we get into Q&A, I actually want to spend a few dedicated minutes talking about how to navigate difficult questions. I already saw them in the Q&A, so we're going to talk about that now up front. And I learned this from last year, where basically it was like, oh, we definitely need to cover this before Q&A. I think maybe this question probably applies to everyone who's tried to engage in a spiritual conversation, where basically you're asked to defend the latest cultural issue. I think there's a question in our Slido right now. It's like, how would you talk to someone who identifies as gay, right? I get asked these questions a bunch. Maybe you do as well. Here's the thing that I want to anchor on, which is you're going to learn this in the preceding weeks, but our faith and Christianity is not like life advice. It is not a system of like, it is a system of belief, but it's not like a life system to like improve your well-being and those type of things. What our faith is based off of is an actual historical event. That's why you guys know the definition of what a gospel is, right? The gospel, it's good news. It's news. It's news. It's a real historical event. Even the Apostle Paul said, basically, if Jesus didn't rise from the dead, like your faith is futile and you're still in your sins, right? Like nothing matters if Jesus didn't actually rise from the dead, right? And that's not me saying it, that's Apostle Paul saying it, right? So our faith is based on an event, not a like cultural like system, okay? That's super, super critical to understand as you're asked to defend a wide variety of cultural things that constantly morph and change year after year, decade after decade, right? And so that's really, really important to anchor on. And so if someone's asking you like about any of these kind of difficult questions, the question I always get to is, well, what do they believe about Jesus? Right? Do they actually believe that Jesus is the Son of God? Did he carry out a ministry of healing and miracles, get executed by the Romans, rise from the grave, appear to 500 and apostles and disciples and carry out a ministry? Like, what do you actually believe about that? And here's why that's really, really important, is that if they don't believe in Jesus, like, why would they care and why would they agree with you on what the Bible says about what our sexual ethic is? Like, why would they agree? Like, it seems it's more often than not really futile to basically get into disagreements or arguments around what the Bible says if they don't believe in Jesus. Because our own opinion should be, well, if Jesus didn't rise from the dead, this Bible is just an advice book, and we can take it or leave it. Right? So everything hinges on whether or not Jesus is who he says he is. And so that's what all of these difficult questions should be viewed under that lens. Right? And so what that translates to is I often find that people are asking difficult questions as like a method or like a tool to like deflect from actually confronting the real evidence, which is like there was a historical person named Jesus, carried out a ministry of healing and miracles, got executed, rose from the dead, appeared to hundreds of people, spawned Christianity today, right? Like those are evidence-based facts that you will spend the next several weeks learning about, that those demand a verdict, like those demand an answer. Like you can't just look at those facts and say, oh, like not for me, like I'm just gonna take it or leave it. You either have to accept it or reject it, right? Like if you're familiar at all with C.S. Lewis, who is a big writer in the early 1950s, philosopher, journalist, he basically spawned with Jesus basically the liar, lunatic Lord, right? Like, right? Either this is a real liar who just is deceiving people, and Jesus was based on his statements, or he's just a crazy person, or he's Lord, right? You have to actually have a verdict on who Jesus was. And depending on what that verdict, all of them basically the difficult biblical questions like fall under that, okay? And so typically when I'm asked really, really challenging questions, I take it to, does the person believe in Jesus? And that's one, and it's not like deflection, it's just talking about what matters and what the priority is, okay? So for example, like I'll leave with one, why is this going backwards? I'll leave you with one example here, which is one of the things that's really unpopular, especially with younger generations, but is like the Christian sexual ethic, right? The sexual ethic of the Bible is that sex is for, covenantal relationships, which for us, that translates to marriage, basically, right? That's really unpopular. That's like if you actually look at like data or surveys, basically everyone under a certain age agrees that you should like live with a prospective spouse together for an extended period of time to make sure that those are good matches, et cetera, right? Like that is a very countercultural perspective, the biblical sexual ethic compared to what culture widely believes today. And so there's lots of questions like, well, why is the Bible like that? What happens with that? Like, why should we follow those rules? And the answer is like, well, I don't know. Like, did Jesus rise from the dead? Do you believe that? Because if he didn't, who cares what the Bible's sexual ethic is? Like, who cares? Like, why does it matter? But if he did rise from the dead, oh man, now we've got to actually deal with that fact. Now we have to talk about like the implications of that, right? And that gets back to like the meaning and how much this is going to affect and change someone's life, right? Whether or not Jesus actually is who he says he is changes everything. And that's where many of these very challenging or difficult questions hinge on. And so maybe we'll see some of that in the Q&A. So hopefully that's helpful We can obviously talk more about it in the Q&A, but I wanted to at least spend a few minutes like intentionally on that to kind of talk through that, because I imagine some of those difficult questions will come up. So just to wrap things up, we get to Q&A. Hopefully none of everything you see on the screen is, hopefully this is all familiar, right? Hopefully I've convinced you that spiritual conversations are pretty challenging. You might have already known that before walking in here, but there's good reasons for that, and hopefully you've seen that. We definitely need to adopt this skill more and more, like where we're at with our country, our culture, the people we engage with, the people who don't even think that this stuff matters to begin with. Like, we have got to find really intentional and strategically effective ways to actually engage with people, get good outcomes from conversations, and that's more important than ever. Who remembers our 2 grounding principles? Who remembers our 2 grounding principles? That's right. That's right. Don't let anyone get mad. Ask questions. Try not to give your opinion. And that's really tough. That's really tough. And look, this is a skill. The more you do it, the better you'll get. Okay? And I promise you, like, one thing I'll tell you is that I love having conversations with people about spirituality and obviously Jesus and those kind of things. And I look forward to them. And in my day-to-day actions, whether it's at work, whether it's in any venue of life, I'm actively looking for ways to have those conversations. And the reason I do that is because, like, I'm confident I can have those, and it could be a good outcome for everyone. Now, hopefully, obviously, hopefully they meet Jesus. But, like, I know that I can engage in these, and I don't risk people getting mad, and I know it's going to turn out okay. And so there's certainly a world out there where you can really feel confident about talking with people about these kind of really deep, meaningful issues where really good outcomes can happen. And I think it's just a matter of being intentional about practicing it. And that could be true of everyone here, because it's not overly complicated, just takes a little bit of work, okay? So we are going to transition to questions. Sarah, you got that? So you should be able to see, oh, that's a little small. That's a bit small. I can see it on my laptop, but can we zoom? Can we do the zoom? We're gonna try to zoom? Okay. Oh, actually, I closed the thing. So this is live. So if you want to add more questions or type in more questions, like, please go ahead and keep adding to them. And then obviously you can click the thumbs up button, which upvotes it, which puts it up to the list. So I'll just be going from top to bottom. Now, one ground rule here. I'm allowed to punt on a question. I'm allowed to punt. And here's why I'll punt. Here's the biggest reason I'll punt, is that, like I talked about earlier, like we inverse this, where essentially last year we talked a lot about the content and the resurrection of Jesus, existence of God, those type of things, and then we talked about the conversation. And so, when we did those Q&As, there was a preceding amount of weeks that really gave you a lot of factual information about why we believe what we believe. Here we've inversed that. And so, for example, if there are questions that we're going to talk about in later weeks, I'll try to briefly address those, but I'll tell you which week we're going to talk about those more in depth. So I just want to acknowledge that, like, due to how we're structuring the class, like, there may be, you may get answers in preceding weeks. Does that sound okay? Does that sound fair? Yeah? We're good? Okay. So let me bring this up. Oh, where'd it go? All right, I got it. All right, so I'm gonna close out this test question. Thank you for upvoting the test question. All right, how did your father approach Oh, it just changed. I don't know why it just changed. How did your father approach conversations when you walked through your early 20s and years of rejecting Christianity? You think I told him? No way. No, no, that's not a punt, that's the truth. So when my father found out my story was last year when I gave a similar version of this in this talk. This is being recorded. I sent him the recording. That was the first my parents had ever heard about my experience in my early 20s. We have a great relationship, by the way. It's not like we're distant. We have a great relationship, but yeah, like, I knew what his answers were going to be. You know, I grew up with the guys, so either way. But yeah, no, I did not tell him. I did not tell him. Both him and my mom were shocked. They were shocked. Yeah. So either way. Okay. How do you respond when someone says, "Do you think I'm going to hell if I don't believe in Jesus?" Oh, that's a good one. Yeah, I mean, well, we haven't, see, we're out of order here, but like, I mean, the first thing I do is like, well, talk about what you mean. Like, what do you mean by hell? I'd ask that. I would absolutely ask that. And then I would say, and see, we're getting ahead of our three-step process, but like, I would ask them that, and then they would give an answer, let's say, and I'd say, well, like, why do you believe that? Like, why do you believe that if you don't believe in Jesus, you go to hell? Like, what has led you to that, like, maybe conclusion or statement or those kind of things? Because I'm assuming they got that information from somewhere, right? And after that, we'd probably talk about, let's see, where would I try to take the conversation? I'd probably take the conversation to, like, have you ever, like, not lived up to your own expectations? Right? Like, I would, and this is like getting to step like 2, 3, etc. But like, someone who asked me this is the beginning of a long conversation. I would not answer this question, like, right at face value, right? Like, and you'll see this lead as you read more of the book and as we like have these sessions. I would not answer these questions at face value. These would be like an entry point to a long conversation, right? So if they define hell, they tell me why they believe it, I'd be like, okay, well, what do you think about people who, you know, do bad things, right? Like, what do you think happens to those people? And, you know, you just continue to ask questions and transition the conversation from there. That's what I would do. So I guess to try to maybe summarize in terms of just like a strategy or whatever, very rarely do I actually answer any question directly that someone asks. Very rarely. Very rarely. Yeah, like very rarely. It's typically like that's the opening question that leads to a conversation, and I'm interested in having that conversation. Because ultimately, if I try to think about this, someone may be asking that because they have a particular view of what should happen to people when they die. And I'm actually interested in learning about what their point of view is on what they think about that.
Versus giving your opinion, because he asked, do you think, right?
Yeah, I mean, it's like, right, like if he's asking, like, do you think I'm going to go to hell, I'm interested in, like, what he thinks happens when people die. Or he or she, you know? Why would I not ask what they believe about Jesus? Yeah, I mean, like maybe, like, again, there's no right way or wrong way of doing this. I think the thing I would, like, having been asked this question before, I'm assuming that they likely don't believe in Jesus, and they're like somewhat offended by the fact that, right, like, where this question often gets asked is like, why is Jesus the only way? Right? And that question comes up quite a bit, which you could take, typically that question evolves around the topic of basically end of life, like what happens when you die. And so that's likely where I would try to really get clear on what they actually believe happens when you die, or what is their current point of view. Because, again, the point is, like, we want to understand what they actually believe, and we want to get clear on how they think about life, not necessarily just give answers, right? Because imagine if they said, like, am I going to hell if I don't believe in Jesus? And they're like, yep, that's what the Bible says. That's what the Bible says. And they'll say, well, like, that's terrible. Like, I don't want to believe that. Well, exactly. And conversation over. Like, you know, right? Like, conversation over. I think you want to get to, I think what you want is hopefully, you're getting the intent behind what I'm saying. But what you want is you want a relationship and you want a conversation. You don't want a question-answer dynamic. Because eventually the questions run out when they get tired of the answers, and that's when the conversation ends, right? And if they believe, right, like imagine you answer that and you say, yeah, that's what the Bible says, great. Cousin Susie now believes that I'm going to hell, so let me like not talk to her ever again, right? Like, that's the point.
But aren't you accused sometimes of not answering their questions?
Who doesn't like to talk about themselves?
Yeah, they don't really catch on to it like when they're in the midst of
Yeah.
answering.
Who doesn't like to talk about themselves? Yeah, I mean, and again, it's not a trick. I'm genuine. If someone is willing to actually ask me this question, which is like a spiritual, religious type question, I'm interested in what they believe. Like, I'm game. Like, hey, we'll get to what I think. I'm interested in what you think. You're obviously asking me this question for a reason. Like, why are you asking the question? Like, what's on your mind? Like, I'm interested in the conversation and the relationship, not to be right, not to give an answer right off the bat. We're playing the long game here, basically.
And someone who's really seeking, I think you made this point earlier, they come back to you, right? It's like they come back to you for follow-up on that conversation.
Yeah.
When you let it go,
Yeah.
all of a sudden, you're not even initiating, and they broach topics again. So they want to have the dialogue.
Yeah, and especially if you have good interactions with people. Like, there's nothing offensive about talking about what you believe about life. Like, there's nothing offensive. It's vulnerable, right? It can be very vulnerable and like uncomfortable, like exposing. It can be very exposing to people. But there's nothing, if you treat that well and they have a really positive interaction, people like talking about that. And I think lots of people have those questions. They're just unwilling to expose that. This is a good question. Good starter question. Okay. All right. If all the names are already in the book of life, why is this important? What is the consequences if we aren't the gardener or harvester? Okay, interesting. So I interpret this question basically as like kind of a predestination question, where it's like, if all of the outcomes are already in place, like why try? There you go. There you go. Yeah, I mean, so that's a great plug, and we definitely have tons of theology, and yeah, do that to the moon. Believe it or not, I actually watched a piece of content on this question recently, and it was an interesting take, and I'm not sharing this is like the answer, but it was from John Piper, who's a well-respected pastor who's been in ministry for many, many, many years. And, there's an attitude where it's like, if you know what the end is, why try? And his perspective is like, if you know what the end is, like, you should have tons of confidence in basically trying and failing and giving everything you got because you know you're going to win in the end. And like, I don't know if that's a good answer, but like that really resonated with me, where it's like, we certainly have a mission and an important part to play. And yeah, does God need us? Like, no, it's God. He can do whatever he wants. But at the same time, like, I think we have an important role to play. And so take the theology class. Take the theology class, but yeah, we can go into like middle knowledge and predestination, but that's outside the scope of apologetics. Yes, sir. Yeah. Yeah. That's a good question. And put those in the Slido too, because I think I caught like 80% of what you said. And so I'll try to rephrase it for maybe those who couldn't hear, which I think was like, how do you balance maybe the relationship of the conversation with like a sense of urgency if someone's really asking you questions? And like, I don't believe that I'm in control of whether someone comes to faith or not. Like, I think I maybe have a role to play, but I don't think like I'm in control of someone's timing. And so if someone comes to me and is willing to spend a day with me and talk through everything, like we'll get to everything. Like, like it really is a matter of the time, the opportunity, the event. And oftentimes what you'll find is like you don't control those things. But I don't think that we really control that. And so I think we may have a sense of urgency because we love people and care about them and desperately want them to get to Jesus. But I think sometimes our sense of urgency actually harms the conversation and pushes people when that's not the right approach. And so I think this is where we can trust the Holy Spirit to really lean on people's hearts, as needed. And again, like if someone wants to spend 10 hours, like we'll get to everything. But like my experience is like typically these conversations happen 30 minutes here, an hour there, and then we all move on with life and do those kind of things.
John was not expecting me to like also answer, but sometimes I can't sit still when I hear a question. So sorry, John. But I like when John was picking up there. I hear your question because you're saying, what if there's a genuineness of them wanting to know? And I think that's where we have to have discernment. I think a lot of these questions, like another one about how do you talk to somebody if they're gay, or, what, am I just going to go to hell? And I think someone was joking about God building a rock larger than, whatever he can lift. And I think, you have to have discernment. Sometimes we ask these questions, or people ask us questions and they're picking a fight or whatever. We can't negate other parts of our theology and our pragmatic ministry. Sometimes we negate it with these questions that we want answers to as black and white. And a lot of this isn't black and white, and that's why we need discernment of the Holy Spirit. So yes, by all means, if there's a genuineness, but I still think what John's communicating is you never forsake the relationship. Never, ever forsake. I'd rather be long-suffering or play the long game, even in urgency, because God is sovereign, and he is working in and through it.
I see some hands up. Put it in the Slido so we can see it on the screen if you have a question. All right, people say the Bible has been translated too many times and contains inaccuracies. This is one I'm punting. We have a week on the historicity of the New Testament and why you should trust it and why it's credible. Be here for that week. You will get this question answered. Okay, so I don't want to steal that thunder. We will absolutely answer this question. Okay. How do you talk to someone who is gay? So this is exactly why I did my difficult questions earlier, right? Which is the Bible's sexual ethic only matters if Jesus was who he says he was and rose from the dead. And so regardless of anyone's gender preferences, sexual orientation, whatever, I'm interested in what they think about Jesus, right? Because if you have someone who has, different sexual preferences, different gender identity, whatever, and they actually believe Jesus is who he says he was and rose from the dead, that is a very different conversation than someone who doesn't believe any of those things and is asking basically, why does the Bible have these points of views on these types of things, okay? And so someone's sexual identity, I think, is something that I wouldn't actually even engage with. Like, I would just talk about what they think about Jesus. And it's only after I get clear kind of on what they think there that we can like really continue the conversation in that direction. So that's what I would focus on. Any questions you would avoid? Absolutely not. Absolutely not. Like, look, I think the great thing about our faith is that it's actually true. Right? Like, I mean, that's the whole point of this, is that this is actually objectively true. This isn't an opinion. And I think that's the pesky thing about Christianity, which, leads to persecution and leads to, some bad outcomes. But we believe this is objectively true. We believe that this is the true view of reality. And look, if it's true, we should be extremely confident that we can navigate any kind of difficult question, any kind of objection, because this is the truth. And what I can tell you is personally growing up, so my father, his work as a Christian philosopher, basically he went around the world and continues even to this day doing debates with some of the world's greatest atheists, thinkers, etc. And it's not even a contest. It's not even a contest. And it's not because he's so good, it's because how true our faith is. So we should be extremely confident that any question that we get, we should be able to navigate. And if you get a question, that you just don't know the answer to, right? Because we all maybe have gaps in knowledge or whatnot. Just say hey, that's a great question. Let me follow up with you. Let me circle back. I don't know the answer right now. Or it's better to say I don't know and preserve the relationship to pick it up at a later time than try to do something. Okay? How do you talk to youth? I'm glad, oh no, this is the rock it's stuck on the screen. Or is it stuck on the screen? So either way, my next, the rock one got downvoted. I'm so sorry, whoever asked the rock question. How do you respond to someone who says faith claims of any religion are not supported by objective evidence, reality, truth? Well, I'd ask them what they mean by objective reality or truth. And look, the reason I'd ask that is I'm interested in what their standard of truth is. They're saying that faith basically is not supported, it's just a belief, there's no evidence. They need to support that. That's a belief in itself, right? So all truth claims are exclusive, right? When I say that there is no truth, that in itself is a truth statement, right? It's self-contradictory. So if someone says there's no evidence, I'm interested in basically understanding what they actually mean by that. Because this is one of those things where you go an inch deep and it really quickly collapses. Okay? Asking, what do you mean by, can feel a little condescending if someone is asking us a specific question. There's variations, right? You don't have to ask, what do you mean, every single time. You can mix it up, hey, tell me more, right? Yeah, I agree that you don't want to sound like a broken record. I would just say in my experience, it doesn't come across condescending. And again, the more you try it, the better you'll get. People love to talk about themselves. I don't know if that's your experience, but it's definitely my experience that when I'm interested genuinely in someone's work, in someone's personal life, in someone's hobbies, they can ramble on. I've got a friend at work who'll literally talk for an hour about the Dallas Cowboys. And I'm not interested in that, but I'm interested in him. And so we talk about that. And that's how it goes, right? So I just find that really being genuinely interested in people and asking, their beliefs, I don't find that to be condescending. But it's a skill, and you certainly don't want to just say, what do you mean, 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 right? I agree with that, if that's the point. Will you get a copy of the slides? Most of the slides are copied in your notes. So I don't think the how to respond to difficult questions is in the notes, so we'll figure that part out. But I think most of it is in the notes. And if there's a gap, follow up with me and we'll figure that out. Do you ever shift from asking questions to giving your opinion? Yes, you do. Yes, you do. And we'll cover that next week. Basically, I'll give you a preview. Basically, when you shift to giving your opinion is when you've asked them enough questions that you're really clear on what their beliefs are. You also, and we'll learn this next week, you ask them why they believe it. So what is the evidence for why they actually hold the beliefs they currently do? And then you're going to ask them questions that actually challenge those beliefs. Once you do that, people will typically, and this is when you know you're successful, people will say, well, what do you believe then? Right? They'll get frustrated that you're actually poking holes in like their belief system, and they'll say, well, fine, like what do you believe? And that's your entry point, right? You've now been invited to provide your opinion, and that's when it's go time. So absolutely, I'm not suggesting that we never provide our opinion, but what I'm suggesting is that there is a process to getting there, and it's that process that makes us much more effective at having these conversations. And I think far too often we are eager to give our point of view when in fact what we should be doing is really focusing on them. We're going to talk. What if no one comes to you to ask questions? How do you incorporate Jesus into day-to-day conversations without being pushy? This is a great question. I initiate conversations all the time, and typically how they happen, it's around like current politics and world events, where like someone will share some kind of belief, right? Like, oh, can you believe this is happening? Like, that doesn't make any sense. Like, oh, this is so frustrating or whatever. And it's typically with something on the news or politics or, various cultural issues. And I'll use that as like a means to get in and basically ask questions and say, oh, like, why do you think that's frustrating? Oh, like, what do you think we should do about it? Oh, well, how do you think about this? Like, what are your worldviews? Like, right? Like, once you like get that in, then you can actually really talk about what people think about those things. And I think, again, the point is ultimately like we want to get a very clear perspective on what people's beliefs are. Part of that is spiritually beliefs, but knowing what their cultural and political beliefs and other types of values, those are equally good as well. And the point is like I want to get to the layer of what their beliefs are. And people share beliefs all the time. And so it's about identifying what those beliefs are and then trying to find an entry point into that. I will do one or two more questions. Here's the rock question. So can God make a rock bigger than he can lift? So we're going to talk about this in week 7. I come back to do the existence of God. And in that content, we go through some like logic lessons on what is a valid like logical argument. This is not a valid logical argument. This is called a circular argument. So this is like a this is not a real argument. So if someone asks you this, just say, hey, this is like a circular argument, and like this doesn't make any sense. So, but this is a fun one. All right, how the conversation be initiated? I think I talked about that. How do you talk to youth? So I'll end on this one because I think this is really, really important. So if you look at like youth statistics on basically how many people who are in middle school, high school, who profess faith, still profess faith like after college, basically. The statistics are alarming. They're very, very alarming. And I think there's a wide variety of reasons why. And obviously, like I'm personally influenced by like my own experience. But I really believe that many of the youth that I interact with, they don't actually know that Christianity is objectively true. They know their parents believe it. They know their parents are great people. They have friends in the church. They have family in the church. But I don't know if we intellectually engage our youth. And so when they confront their professor at college who actually gives them some real objections, and they've got friends and other types of influences around them, I think it's easy to maybe shed the beliefs of your youth for newer, higher, elevated, ideas, right? And so I've talked to a variety of youth, like a lot of children from the life group that I'm in, with like kids of parents that we're in life group with. And I think time and time again, like what I'm talking to them about is like the stuff that actually we're talking about in this class and in this course. Like